The River Dee, a river of superlatives, divine and royal. Of all the rivers in the Highlands, the Dee is one of the most famous, and I'm following it for 88 miles, all the way to the sea. Scotland's rivers are among the country's greatest treasures. The enduring force of their seaward flow has shaped the landscape. Since the earliest times, they've been used as natural highways. In this series, I'm celebrating the rich and fruitful relationship between rivers and people, uncovering intriguing tales from the past and meeting a cast of characters as I travel across Scotland, exploring the original waters of life. In this programme, I'm setting off down the River Dee on a grand tour through the heart of the Cairngorm Mountains. The River Dee starts just below the summit of Britain's third highest mountain before it flows down through Deeside, where I discover a history of violence and warfare, learn about the spirit of the place and seek a royal seal of approval. The magnificent Cairngorm Mountains are the setting for the birth of the River Dee. It rises here at over 1,200 metres, making it the highest source of any river in the British Isles. Its eastward journey begins as it cascades down the side of Bray Riach, the UK's third highest mountain. As it heads downhill, it flows through a deep glacial trench that cuts through the mountains, called the Larry Grue. It's a spectacular start to a river. The word Dee, as in the River Dee, apparently derives from an ancient Celtic language, and it means a goddess. Now, I'm not surprised that early people felt there was something sacred about a river that rises in such spectacular landscape. The majesty and magic of the landscape surrounding the Dee's upper reaches captured the imagination of local writer and Aberdonian Nan Shepherd. She devoted herself to discovering the many moods and mysteries of the Cairngorms and described her journey in her beautiful book, The Living Mountain. Written in the 1940s, it's a distillation of her experiences, walking, sleeping and swimming in the hills. But the book was more than that. It was part poetic epic, part philosophy, part love poem to the mountain. To learn more about Nan's masterpiece, I've joined writer Merrin Glover, who tells me that the book is about the whole Cairngorm range.
She asserted that you really have to understand them as one mountain, that although they're kind of split by, say, the Larry Grue, that they're kind of part of the one great massif of granite and need to be understood as a whole. Because that's a big part of what she was talking about, was that whole sense of oneness, that not only is the mountain one, but every element within it is integral to its life, and that ultimately she came to realize she also was integral to its life.
What drew her initially to the mountain, to the Cairngorms, to these fantastic peaks?
She grew up, as she said, running in the hills of Deeside and also the Monoliaths on the other side of the Cairngorms. And family holidays in the Monoliaths, she said she would look across from that range of hills to the Cairngorms, and she describes this particular violet gully on the back of Scorandoo, which kind of pulled on her and called her and thrilled her to life, to the Cairngorms.
There is something magnetic about mountains, is there not? I mean, I love mountains. When I'm in the valleys, looking up at the summit, that's where I want to be. It must have been the same feeling that she experienced.
She also said initially she had a lust for the summits. So like lots of mountaineers, she set off up to get to Ben Macdui, the highest first, and she did all of the high summits and so on. And then it was over time that she began to discover the more hidden places, the recesses, and to slow down a lot more.
What was she looking for?
She was looking for what she called the essence of the mountain. But she also recognized over time that the mountain gave to her most fully when she went to it without any expectation or any destination, when she just went out to spend time with him as you would with a friend.
So it's a kind of relationship she's building up over time. It becomes quite an intimate relationship.
Well, it very much became that. Yeah, she talked about it as a traffic of love.
And what do you think her legacy is?
Just through her sheer love of this place and her capacity to bring it to life in the way she wrote about it, she helps us to foster a sense of appreciation for it and how precious it is, how beautiful it is, and how much we need to commit ourselves to caring for it as well as climbing it.
It's a lesson for today.
Nan wrote that water was a vital and meaningful part of the landscape that she so loved. Like all profound mysteries, she wrote, it's so simple that it frightens me. It wells from the rock and flows away. It does nothing, absolutely nothing, but be itself. Reflecting on Nan's words, I follow the pure water along the course of the River Dee. In the 18th century, townships dotted the banks of the river here, with the water providing an important resource. It must have been a hard way of life, and not necessarily a peaceful one. These ruins are all that remains of the birthplace of a notorious rebel, Peter Grant, or Old Dubrach. Painted at over 100 years old, he was a proud Jacobite and fought for the exiled Stuart king at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Local author Ian Murray tells me about the exploits of this famous character.
So he was the carnage at Culloden. He survived that and was taken prisoner and taken down to Carlisle Castle, and then managed to escape by scaling the walls.
So was he on the run then, do you think?
He would have been on the run. So coming here would have been difficult, even although it's a remote place. You know, sometimes you stand out more in a remote place. And just to compound matters, the Redcoats had a garrison up here.
This was occupied ground then, occupied territory?
This was occupied. He did come back here and farm for a while, and then eventually retired and went off to Glenlethnet, which is across the hills. It's quite an old guy, over 100 years old.
Over 100 years old.
And there was two walkers came by, and he started regaling them with stories about the 45 rebellion, and he gave them a demonstration with a broadsword, and they were very taken with him. But he was living in poverty. You know, he was a very poor man. So they petitioned the local minister, who then put a petition through Walter Scott to the king.
George IV?
George IV. He was coming to Edinburgh, and he said that no time should be wasted, and should be granted a pension of £50 a year.
He did well out of being a rebel, didn't he, when you think about it? He's getting a king's pension for being a rebel and surviving.
Yeah. The story goes that he said to him, "You're my oldest friend," the king said to him, and he said, "Actually, I'm your oldest enemy."
A rebel to the end.
Well, interesting character.
Sadly, the rebel from humble Deeside only enjoyed his royal pension for a couple of years before he died at the ripe old age of 110. Just 5 years after his death, tragedy struck for the communities along the river when they experienced the Muckle Spate, or the Great Flood.
On the 3rd of August 1829, a tremendous storm swept across the northeast of Scotland, and in just a few hours, 6 inches of rain had fallen, and the level of the River Dee rose to a record-breaking 27 feet.
The disaster was captured by the artist Landseer in his painting Flood in the Highlands, which shows people and animals cowering on a roof as the river sweeps away livestock below. Across the whole area, 600 families were left destitute, 60 homes were lost, and 22 bridges were destroyed.
The old bridge over the famous Linn of Dee was an early victim to the Muckle spate. Now, although it stood 30 feet above the normal level of the river, it was completely swept away, which demonstrates the destructive force of the flood.
In 1857, a new bridge was opened by Queen Victoria, who was holidaying on Deeside. Bagpipes played. The entire royal family was dressed in royal Stuart plaid, and she recorded the event in her diary. A triumphal arch was erected. On the bridge we drank to its prosperity in whisky. Nearly 60 years after the royal opening, the new bridge faced a threat from an entirely different source: the air. Incredibly, during World War I, German airships, meant to be targeting the Forth Bridge and British fleets near Rosyth and Invergordon, flew up Deeside. To find out how the Germans ended up in these remote glens, I'm meeting up with local historian Maureen Kelly.
8 zeppelins set off, and they got on well until they got to about Northumberland, and then they hit bad weather, and 6 of them went down to bomb Manchester area, which was the plan, and then 2 set up for Scotland.
Right.
And one of them was L20, which ended up here.
But it must have been fantastically off course.
Yes, they got lost with the terrible weather and icy snow and very low clouds. Now this was May, this was the 2nd of May.
Oh, a typical day in May.
Typical day in May, yes. And our guy was meant to be going to Invergordon.
I'm just trying to imagine what it must have been like, you know, this zeppelin, because they were huge.
1.5 times the size of a football pitch.
Loaded presumably with weapons, with bombs.
Yes, it had up to 10,000 pounds of bombs.
Now, did anyone hear the approach of these zeppelins?
Yes, way up in the glen here, miles away from anywhere, is a little croft called Louis Beg, and the family MacDonald were there. Nell, who was 16 at the time, described it as an awful noise, a zeppelin. Zoom, zoom.
It was Nell's father Sandy, the local gamekeeper, who found physical evidence of the Zeppelin's misadventure up the glen 5 years later.
This is the water flare from the Zeppelin L20 that they dropped to find out if they were over water or over land.
And how does it work?
Well, apparently, when it's dropped and it hits water, it ignites, and this cork at this end here allows it to float on water, and so you get a flare in the water and they know that they're over the sea.
Unfortunately for the German crew, the water flare was little help when it hit open hillside, from where Sandy picked it up in 1921.
2 or 3 days later, he was due to take Edward, Prince of Wales, stalking, and he mentioned to him he'd found this.
Really?
And he was really interested and said, I could send this to the ministry, the Air Ministry, and they would tell us what it was. And so sometime later, a package came back to Sandy, and in it said, Sandy MacDonald from Edward P. It's quite safe now.
Now, what happened to the L20, this zeppelin that got lost?
Well, it carried on, went up Loch Ness, and then it went over Orkney. It knew he couldn't get back to Germany, and so he headed for neutral Norway, and they actually crash landed.
So the whole military adventure was really a complete and utter failure.
Absolutely a disaster. And it didn't have the terrorising effect that it was hoped to have, because it was, I mean, you know, you can see the population that it was terrorising up here.
Given the remote location, it's perhaps not surprising that no one was injured, but it's a fantastic and farcical episode in the history of Deeside. Leaving Maureen, I head east for 5 kilometres to the confluence of the River Dee and Cuich Water. Just upstream is a gigantic natural hole in a rock known as the Cuich Punch Bowl, which in times past had a bottom.
Now, the Punch Bowl is another Deeside location with a warlike connection. According to local legend, a group of Highland chiefs, Jacobites who supported the exiled Stuart kings, met here in 1715 to plot and to plan and to drink to the success of the rebellion they just started.
It's said that the hollowed-out stone was filled with whiskey and honey for the purpose of toasting the exiled king across the water.
Now, I'm guessing, but it must have taken several barrels of whiskey to fill the punch bowl, and the revellers must have been blind drunk by the time they drained it dry. And is it any surprise that the rebellion of 1715 ended in failure?
Sadly, it's now impossible to fill the punch bowl with anything, let alone whiskey. But then we live in more sober times. Heading back to the main course of the River Dee, it's just 2 kilometres to my next destination, the village of Braemar. It's the first centre of population along the course of the river and is famous for its Arctic winter temperatures and its Highland Games. But I'm here to meet a guy, and that guy is Gareth Guy, who I'm hoping can show me how to make a traditional walking stick to aid my journey down the River Dee.
Now, Gareth, I'm in need of a walking stick.
Okay.
And I've been told you're the man to come to.
I shall certainly do my best.
So how do we start?
We'll start off with we'll select an antler here. We can cut it here.
Right, is that for the
and
handle?
Here. This will make the handle. This will make a nice sort of thumbstick here. So you can just hold the stick like that when you're out on the hills.
I'm given the short end of the stick and am tasked with cutting my antler down to size. Then Gareth adds wooden tips to my handle. It's a wonder that he can find his workbench crammed in amongst hundreds of antlers.
We should make the point that the antlers are not coming necessarily from dead deer, because they shed their antlers annually, don't they?
They do indeed. Every sort of springtime, and they will grow a new pair. That shows that it's an antler that has been sort of shed by the deer naturally, so rather than one that has been cut. Fastest growing bones in the world, and can grow up to an inch a day.
Good grief, really?
So yeah, it's quite amazing.
After sanding down the wooden tips, I give them a good buff.
It's like having a dental polish.
It is.
Before Gareth puts a hole in the base of the handle and adds a thread.
And then that just slots into there. And then once that is dried, there is your stick.
It could be a thing of beauty.
That's it.
Leaving Gareth to stick it out in the workshop, I stride out with my new stick. All that dust has given me a dry throat. In search of refreshment, I pop into the Fife Arms Hotel, where I find Katie Fennemer amongst hundreds of bottles of whiskey. Also known as the Water of Life, our now famous national drink has been distilled along Deeside for centuries, but not always legally. Katie tells me about the local goings-on.
Whisky in the past, especially when it's being made illicitly, it wouldn't have been matured at all. So it would have been drunk straight from the still, sometimes still hot actually. It would have been completely clear. It would have been quite lethal stuff.
Now, they produce the whiskey and then they try and get it out to market as soon as they could. So how was that done?
Lots of different ways. Coffins are very useful. There's actually a great story from when Braemar Castle was a military garrison in the 1750s. A soldier writes home to his family in England and he says, it's very strange, you know, but the women in Braemar are always pregnant. But of course the women weren't pregnant at all. What they had is a little cask of whiskey underneath their dresses, and off they went further south down the road to sell it.
Well, they were smuggling it out of Braemar.
They were indeed.
To get a better idea of what these canny Braemar folk were up to, Katie offers to take me to the remains of one of the illegal stills. We head up into the hills along one of the Dee's tributaries, where the water would have been integral to the whiskey-making process. It's a landscape that was scattered with illicit stills hundreds of years ago.
In the 1780s, 4,000 illicit stills were found in just the Highlands of Scotland alone.
Those are the ones that were found.
Those were the ones that were found, exactly. This was big business, and I really think it's not an exaggeration to say in every remote glen like this one, right around Scotland, everyone was distilling illegally whiskey.
Katie's been searching for evidence of these illegal sites and during lockdown set herself the challenge of finding the location of an illicit still every day for 45 days.
So what were the clues you were looking for?
You're looking for a river because we need water really right through the whole process. You're looking for a raised area so you can look out for the excise man as he's coming through. A flat area to lay out your barley to help it to germinate
Right,
at the
that's
very
for the
start.
malt.
Exactly,
Yeah.
that's for the malt. And you're wanting to be just a little bit away from the community so as not to arouse suspicion.
Well, let's see if we can find one.
Katie leads me over boggy ground and up to some stone ruins where the distilling was done.
So this would have been quite a low structure, would have had a heather thatch on the roof and really quite well hidden. And from inside here, there would have been a fire, a short dumpy still on top where they would have been making their ushkava.
A copper still, rather bigger, but similar in spirit and design to this one here.
Yes, I mean this kind of shows you how they work, if you like. So I mean, distillation works on the principle that alcohol boils at a lower temperature to water, and as it was heated, vapours would have risen up, and they would go up to the top of the still, over the arm here, and then we would have had what we know as a worm, a condenser here, a coil of copper, which would have been immersed in cold water from our river, and you would be left with your ushkava ready to go.
But of course, ushkava coming from a still in a place like this, I imagine would have been pretty rough.
Well, actually, I think the best way to answer that is to serve you some of the stuff if you would like to try it.
Well, I'd never say no to an offer like that.
I keep a lookout for the excise men as Katie pours the imitation spirit that's been distilled with locally foraged plants and sweetened with honey.
Sláinte.
Sláinte.
Definitely a lot of honey in there. Quite a punch though, isn't it? It's quite strong stuff.
It's coming in at around about 67% alcohol,
Right, wow.
so yes, we'll certainly be walking down in a slightly different manner to how we walked up.
Gingerly making my way back downhill, I continue along the Dee, which becomes increasingly regal as I approach Balmoral, the summer home of the British monarchy. The castle was redesigned and rebuilt in the 1850s and became Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's much-loved Royal Highland home and the place where Queen Elizabeth II spent her final weeks. Hanging inside Balmoral's ballroom today is an extraordinary sculpture, 250 hand-blown glass fish that seem to float in mid-air. It commemorates the royal association with the River Dee and another monarch, the King of Fish, the mighty Atlantic salmon.
When Queen Victoria came to Balmoral on holiday, her husband, Prince Albert, loved to try his luck fishing for salmon in the River Dee, accompanied by his faithful gillie, the Highland servant, John Brown.
John was a local lad, and his down-to-earth and loyal nature earned him a trusted position in the royal household. To find out more about his role, I'm joining historian Heidi Merkens to visit the statue of John Brown in the castle grounds.
Queen Victoria visited Balmoral for the first time in 1848, and by the time he was already working here as a stable boy. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, he became an even more significant person in Queen Victoria's life. Basically, they had a very personal relationship until he died in 1883. That's 30 years of relationship.
What was it about his character that enabled him to have such an influence?
I think Queen Victoria saw in John Brown an embodiment of the values she appreciated so much of Scotland, really. He was direct, he said it as it was, and he wasn't afraid of her as well in her position.
As he became the Queen's favourite, was he showered with gifts?
We know that his salary as a member of the household rose basically from year to year, and at some point he earned a significant £400 per annum, which was really quite substantial.
Yes.
And she gave him a cottage here at Balmoral, and lots of honours, made him a squire as well, so yes.
How did this go down with the rest of the court, and in particular Queen Victoria's children?
There was a huge scandal around the relationship between Queen Victoria and John Browne. So it was not just that he was a favourite, but that he was a visible favourite, that he was around her all the time in his Highland dress, so he would stand out as well, and he was recognisable. So people started to make up all kinds of stories around the two.
How was that reported in the press?
There were rumours that Queen Victoria was in love with John Browne, that they were secretly married even. People knew her as Mrs. Browne. That was quite cheeky, really.
Speculation of an affair grew when the Queen was buried with a ring belonging to Browne's mother and his photo in her hands.
Also, we have to see this in context as well, because she took many mementos from close friends, like locks of hair and photographs. So she was buried with a lot of mementos.
If anything, this story tells me that Queen Victoria was a quite romantic and sentimental person.
I think so, yes, a very passionate woman as well. She wrote passionate letters and used a very romantic language as well when she wrote to people. We know that she, for example, addressed John Browne in letters as my darling one or my dearest. But this doesn't necessarily mean they had a romantic relationship or an amorous relationship. It is an expression of deep felt friendship.
Of love.
At the time.
An aspect of love.
Yes, an aspect of love and devotion and loyalty that was very important to her.
Sadly, Victoria's affectionate nature concerned her children, and evidence of her passionate relationship was hidden away. John Browne's statue now sits alone in the woods. Leaving Balmoral, I crossed the River Dee and set off to scale a modest hill called Craigaclavin with the aid of my trusty new stick. It's a gentle climb and gives me time to reflect on the life of John Browne and his relationship with Queen Victoria.
The Victorian age is often depicted as a time when emotions were stifled, when people were constrained by social convention, when a glimpse of stocking was seen as something shocking. But when it comes to Queen Victoria herself, this doesn't quite ring true. She comes across as a passionate, romantic woman whose life was rocked by strong emotions.
Reaching the summit, I find a perch above Royal Deeside. At the end of a journey that's been overflowing with the water of life, it seems fitting to take a spot of traditional refreshment, a wee sensation to remind me of the spirit of the place.
Now, I'm quite sure that John Browne would have come up here as a wee boy, and perhaps as a young man, to watch the river winding far below, where his fate and his future as the Queen's closest companion was marked out, making this a fine place for me to end the first leg of my grand tour down the River Dee.
My next grand tour continues down the River Dee, from the village of Ballater to the coastal city of Aberdeen.